The Armed Forces Heritage Museum is proud to present a 6-episode series entitled Portraits of the Greatness of Our Generations. As Japan expands its empire, the winds of war gather speed, and Hitler moves aggressively in Europe. This is Episode 1, World War II. It's 1938 in Germany. An 18-year-old Ernest Kaufmann is at work and responds to an alert to return home as the horrors of Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, ensue. In just a few hours, close to 100 Jews were killed and more than 1,600 synagogues and numerous Jewish business establishments throughout Germany were ransacked and many were burned to the ground.
10th of November, 38. I get a frantic phone call from my sister, Ernest, go home immediately. All the synagogues are burning. I'm not there for a half hour, and our local policeman shows up. I've got orders to arrest every Jewish male between the ages of 16 and 65, quote unquote, for their own protection from the enraged German populace. The result was arresting probably 30 or 40,000 Jewish males between the ages of 16 and 65 and shipping them off to the various concentration camps. And we were marched off to the railroad station. There was a train that was waiting for us, and it took off. We had no idea where we were headed. Eventually, I don't know after how many hours, we ended up at Weimar, and then, of course, knew what was up. Weimar is right next to the Buchenwald concentration camp. We saw them flog people until they were unconscious. We saw them hang people. We saw them tie a man's hand behind his back, then hang him on what I thought was meat hooks, like meat hooks, on the wall until, of course, they fainted and fell, and then they cut him down. If you think that was bad, the worst thing we saw was when they took a prisoner, stuck him into a barrel that was spiked with nails, and rolled him down the hill. And then, of course, bleeding as he was, let dogs finish him off. I mean, that's man's inhumanity in action.
Mr. Kaufmann's parents were able to gain his release from Buchenwald concentration camp with the proviso that he leave Germany immediately to join sponsors in the United States. He sailed from Germany on the SSS America. He arrived in New York and found work. He taught himself to speak English.
Pearl Harbor came, December 7th, 41. I'm going to enlist because I've got a reason to go and fight.
Ernest excelled during basic training and was accepted into Officers Candidate School, commissioned as second lieutenant, and trained as an intelligence officer. Meanwhile, back in the United States, Howard Brooks joins the Navy to serve his country in 1939.
I joined the Navy September the 3rd, the day Hitler marched into Poland. And a week later, I was in boot camp. I was transferred to the USS Houston and the Asiatic Fleet. It was just after dark. Word was announced, all hands, now hear this. We are now in a state of war. Pearl Harbor has been bombed by the Japanese. Our first contact with the Japanese was February the 4th. I remember it was about 9 o'clock in the morning. We counted at least 45 planes, and we watched anti-aircraft guns. And the next thing we knew, we were in the middle of a landing force. All I saw that night was Japanese destroyers. I think for a whole solid hour, we were firing everything we had on the ship. Their planes were flying over us just like it was daylight. We lasted for almost an hour. We had taken torpedoes on the starboard side, and we had a big list. The captain announced abandoned ship. I went over, and there was a raft close by, and it was loaded with severely injured guys. So I just caught a hold to the side. And I stayed 2 nights in the water. But finally, we got into the beach with that raft. Got this truck coming up the road toward us. It got close. 2 guys were standing in the back, and they holding this flag with the big red dot in it.
The nation geared up for the war effort. Young men, like Arthur Seltzer, were drafted into the armed forces, and the nation's military strength rapidly grew as the war progressed.
At that time, there was a big draft, and when your number was called, you automatically were in the Army. I trained with the 99th Infantry Division, and I was to go to a very special school to learn how to use radio, telephone, and teletype without wire. The radio itself weighed 65 pounds. In England, right across from Calais, we started to build a dummy group of vehicles and all kinds of equipment, and soldiers was running around so that they would believe that's where the invasion was going to come from. By doing that, Hitler moved all of his SS troops up to Calais, France.
What we were training for was to land on enemy beaches with our radios and then spot the targets and radio back to the ships. We headed over toward southern England to the town of Weymouth, and there was the LCI 492. I mean, we didn't know anything about an invasion. We didn't know about Normandy. We knew nothing. We were being transferred someplace. They put radios on there, and they sort of made us like a headquarters LCI. Yeah, the LCI is it's actually the smallest ocean-going ship in the Navy. She carries a crew of 4 officers, about 24 men. She's 150 feet long with about a 24-foot beam. The LCIs, they go right up onto the beach. You have a flat bottom. I think they took a draft in the front of about 4 feet. We have ramps on each side, and we didn't have any doors opened up or anything like that. And the soldiers run down these 2 ramps onto the beach. A few days before the invasion, boy, all these troops are coming on the ship, and we're loaded down with troops. So I said, well, you got something big's going to happen. They said, no, they've been there like for about maybe 6 months. Said, it's just going to be another practice run. Something's going to happen. So then I said, this isn't another practice run. And then about 5 o'clock, we set special to start pulling out from the dock, and we get out in the open sea. You can see ships, all kinds of ships. You got transports, you got warships, you got landing craft. All these ships, were all breaking through the sea and all heading for France. And it was rough. It was really rough.
We all knew it was coming. You couldn't even guess when and how's it going to be handled. Well, we were a lead crew at that time. We were briefed at 6 o'clock at night, the night before, about what was going to happen on the 6th of June, what our mission was, what our target was. And I can always remember the briefing officer, if either one of you make one goddamn word about where you're going, you're dead.
We sailed all night, and about 0300, we arrived at the assault area right off of Normandy.
D-Day, the first mission was to bomb the beaches. On our way over, we couldn't see much of the water, but by the time we had dropped their bombs and began our return, the visibility of the channel was much better, and we could see what it was like down there. It was just one mass of ships. That's all you could see. You could hardly see the water.
At 5:30 in the morning, the battleships opened up. The battleship Nevada, Texas, Tuscaloosa cruiser, and the Quincy, and others that they started barraging. For a half hour, they just threw things in.
When the first landing craft landed on Omaha Beach, 80 to 90% of them were either wounded or killed immediately. We got a message back: don't go out the front of the landing craft. The machine guns along the beach are all trained, waiting for the gangplank to go down. Go over the side of the ship on both sides and then work your way into shore. You cannot build a foxhole in wet sand. We only had one place to hide, and that was behind a dead body. It was the only way that we could save our life.
We went into Omaha Beach. We landed at low tide because the Germans had obstacles on the beach. Our signalman, he was on the bridge, he saw all this, and he said the guys were running down these ramps. He said as soon as they run down the ramps, they were being cut down because they also had a pretty big target. The Germans were up on the hill there, and they were matrixed in. Rommel really built an Atlantic wall, and they were mowing them down as they come across. And what the soldiers try to do is make it up this seawall, like a seawall there. And if they get there, the Germans couldn't shoot at them, so they were bunched up against there. The others were just laying there on the beach. They didn't even move. So our LCI really took a beating on Omaha. We said that was probably one of the bloodiest days in Coast Guard's history.
I sent a message to the battleships that were off the shore, and I told them that if we didn't get a hole blown in that buff, we were never going to get off the beach. All of a sudden, the guns opened up, and a buff was definitely blown in it.
Bradley was going to recall Omaha Beach. They were going to give it up at loss and go into Utah. But then the Navy destroyers went in, turned broadside, and went up and down the beach all day and knocked out every German bunker on that beach.
On the second mission, the targets were inland, railroad marshaling yards, and the purpose of that was to damage the transportation system.
Before I got off the beach, I found the sergeant who was in charge of our group, and he told me that he and I were the only two that survived out of the 36 people.
June 6, 1944. The D-Day invasion was a key event in winning the war in Europe. By day's end, over 150,000 Allied troops had successfully stormed and captured Normandy's beaches, but at a high price. By some estimates, over 4,000 Allied troops had lost their lives and thousands more were recorded as wounded and missing. Operation Overlord successfully marked the beginning of the liberation of German-occupied Western Europe from Nazi control. Ernest Kaufmann landed at Normandy on D+5. He immediately began his role as an interrogator of German prisoners and gathering battlefield intelligence. As the army moves forward, he demonstrates his ability to talk German soldiers out of fighting, often resolving situations without firing a shot. His abilities came to the supreme test when he found himself out on a reconnaissance patrol as the American army drove into the heartland of Germany.
Stupid impulse, I go into town, white rag on my Jeep and headed for town. Passed some German soldiers that were too surprised to stop us. In the middle of town we could stop, and I said, look, I got orders to see the commanding general. And I was called to the general's office. Stand in front of the general there. I tell him my name is so-and-so, and I'm from the American commanding officer opposing you. I have orders to tell you, or to ask for the immediate surrender of the town of Einbeck, and that we're prepared to attack, and I'm supposed to wait for an answer. 15 minutes later, the general calls me into his office. Well, I've decided to accompany you to your commanding officer and to surrender the city.
Captured by the Japanese and transported to a POW camp, Howard began work on the railroad which was needed by the Japanese to supply troops and weapons during the Burma campaign.
He took us into Moulmein. That was the beginning of the railroad. The railroad was laid out. There were stakes in the ground and lines drawn. after we would build it up, there would be culverts to make out of wood. And there were stones. You would sit down and you would bang rocks all day long, carry them over and put on top of the fill. They hadn't been giving us too much food, and everything they did give us, it was just plain rice, and they throw some vegetables in it. It turned out to be that's all we had for the rest of the 3.5 years. You had your little mat, you lay on that. And if you were lucky, you had a blanket to lay on that. Typical day, we would get up with daylight, and the cooks would have the great big pot. It was always the same thing, morning, noon, or night. We worked every day. There was no days off. But working down through the jungle, when we built a railroad along a cliff, or the cliff was one side of it, oh, you worked for days just making a place to anchor the cliff side. The other side, you had to build up. We had to cut the trees, trim them, haul them in. Thank the good Lord for elephants. We had some elephants that lifted those things. The end of the railroad, where the bridge on the River Kwai was, we heard that they're taking groups, train loads every day down the peninsula to Singapore. They're going on ships to Japan. And a Japanese army officer, he said that the Japanese emperor has seen fit to end the war. War is no more. You will be going home. Everybody went crazy.
After the war resulted in victory in 1945, these young men were among the fortunate to survive and return home. The GI Bill provided many veterans with new education to help them transition into post-war civilian life. Ernest Kaufman became a highly successful poultry farmer. Howard Brooks went to college and became an electrical engineer. Peter Fontecone trained to be a state administrator. Arthur Seltzer was hired as a salesman at an Army-Navy store. He earned a degree in marketing. He retired as vice president of marketing and sales. Robert Hanson retired from the Air Force and then for 35 years managed the Veterans Office at Joint Base McGuire. The transition of these men and women from military to civilian life enabled the nation to prosper in the post-war years. This has been the first of a series of segments that will honor the men and women who served the nation from World War II up to and including the struggle in Afghanistan. Stay tuned and watch for the next installment that will feature the greatness of our generations. The next Armed Forces Heritage Museum episode will highlight the men who responded to the nation's call to halt communist aggression when the North Koreans invaded South Korea in 1950.